Welcome to Crime Scene Investigation and Protection. Learning objectives. Crimes are becoming more prevalent as the cannabis industry grows, and this training will help you to do your part to help ensure that all crime scenes remain secure for investigation and protected. So you'll have a plan to implement when a crime scene occurs that'll assist law enforcement. The goal of the Crime Scene Investigation and Protection Unit is to identify, document, and preserve physical evidence that will yield information, aid in the investigation, and reconstruct the actions or events that occurred within the crime scene. This training is meant to aid cannabis businesses in developing specialized knowledge and training in evidence identification, documentation, and preservation techniques. Crime scene investigation is often performed by experts known as investigators and involves the careful gathering of such evidence, which is then analyzed at a crime laboratory. The most important aspect of evidence collection and preservation is protecting the crime scene. You'll learn how to keep the pertinent evidence uncontaminated until it can be recorded and collected. The successful prosecution of a case can hinge on the state of the physical evidence at the time it is collected. The protection of the scene begins with the arrival of the first law enforcement officer at the scene and ends when the scene is released from police custody. Learning objectives. Crime scene processing protocol. Forensic investigation techniques. Crime scene protection. Different crime types. Crime scene size. Scene search patterns. Victim evidence and investigation questions. Crime scene victims. Defining crime scene. General evidence packaging. Liquid and dry material collection. Different evidence types. Chain of custody. Crime scene processing. Scene investigator responsibilities. Crime scene processing protocol. No one wants to think about crime scenes and how robberies are becoming more common, but they are a reality for all cannabis businesses, particularly retail operators. Even if you are not talking about robberies, you'll find yourself thinking about them, so we'll be looking at a crime scene processing protocol on how you go about examining a crime scene. Starting with the investigation, it always involves the Locard's exchange principle, which states that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something into the crime scene and leave something from it, and that both can be used as forensic evidence. The first crime laboratory was established in 1910 in Lyon, France, by Edmond Locard. Dr. Edmond Locard was a pioneer in forensic science, who became known as the Sherlock Holmes of Lyon, France. He formulated the basic principle of forensic science, which states, "Every contact leaves a trace." It is generally understood that every contact between two items, there will be an exchange. That principle gave rise to the forensic sciences, which are the accumulated methods for developing and analyzing physical evidence from crime scenes. The fact that something is always leaving that trace, it's our goal here as investigators, to try to find those trace evidence. Keep in mind, you don't want to overthink things. Sometimes, you want to use simple logic to help direct our investigation. You want to use the scientific method, as well as go far through the problem-solving process while staying organized. Organized so that you can refer back to notes, refer back to diagrams, photos, pictures, evidence collected, so that you can find answers to questions that may be asked shortly after the initial investigation had taken place. Forensic investigation techniques. Investigation techniques can involve surveying the scene, documenting observations, collecting evidence, and then you have identification, which is the comparison to what is out of the norm, what doesn't look right. This process can help evaluate and interpret to reconstruct the crime scene, and these techniques involve the presentation of findings to reconstruct what and how things may have occurred based on all of the evidence collected. But how do you go about this process? Step 1. Interview victims. You want to interview the victims and/or the first officers at the scene to determine what happened, by finding out what type of crime took place and how it was committed. This information may not be completely factual, but it's intended to provide the crime scene investigator with a starting place. always remember, when being interviewed by an investigator, that only because you were there during the crime, they will never take your testimony as being completely correct. This is simply to provide them an investigation starting place. Step 2. Examination phase. Initial interviews will lead to the examination phase to identify possible evidence, select a point of entry and a point of exit, and develop a general layout of the crime scene. So all these can be very important in an examination process, and again that first step of that interview can help you at least initially plan and organize how you're going to go about the examination step. Step 3. Collect documentation. Then you will always have documentation to review that ranges from the physical crime scene to even digital evidence collected through security cameras, etc. And this is very important. You want to create both digital photographic or video evidence, a rough sketch of the crime scene, identify the exact position of victims, and other documentation that can be found in the crime scene. This can be a very time-consuming and tedious process, but it is vitally important to keep things organized and to also ensure that anything that's being collected will be upheld in court as evidence. Step 4. Crime scene processing. When investigators are done processing the scene, then crime lab technicians are responsible for identifying, evaluating, and collecting physical evidence from the scene, so it's further analyzed in the laboratory. During this processing point, this includes both physical and testimonial evidence. They will be collecting more specific data, but this may not be done for every piece of data collected, which helps guide the investigation where that time is going to be spent, as they're recreating what may have occurred. Crime scene protection. When a crime is first reported to law enforcement, there are two actions that are immediately taken to initiate the crime scene investigation and protection. 1. Protection. Law enforcement will be immediately sent to the crime scene to protect it as soon as possible, so there's no crime scene contamination. 2. Information. This will be restricted to senior law enforcement officials, as the forensic science team reports the evidence that is found during the crime scene investigation. The responsibility of the first officer on the crime scene is to stop all unauthorized personnel from entering the crime scene, and this important rule is often ignored or sidestepped many times. The crime scene is secured once the suspects, witnesses, and victims have all been completely removed. Then adequate staffing should be deployed to safeguard it. All these initial activities should be carefully monitored by the first responder or the investigator, whose responsibility is to investigate the crime scene. Initially, every single piece of furniture, door, window, light switch, etc. will be carefully documented for any fingerprints at the crime scene. If applicable, the victim's body should never be removed and should be left undisturbed until the crime scene has been finally processed or documented. Essential evidence may exist on the victim's body and could be lost if anyone attempts to remove it, but if there is any chance that they're still alive, then emergency services should be arranged immediately. Anyone admitted into the scene after it has been secured should only be individuals who have a specific role in investigating the crime. Everyone from the general public and press should be restricted from entering, and if the suspect was detained during the crime, they should not be allowed to enter, since it would compromise evidence. The first responder's law enforcement responsibilities end once he hands over the control of the crime scene to the official crime scene investigator. Many times, the first responding officer is required to stay at the crime scene is necessary to communicate what they know and help maintain continuity as different investigators arrive. Remember that even a little carelessness while protecting the crime scene can easily lead to non-conclusive results in laboratory analysis, so evidence collection and protection of crime scenes should be done carefully. 1. The investigator has to be vigilant in investigating, protecting the crime scene. 2. Many times, preserving the smallest details plays an important role in the investigation. Remember, perfection is never guaranteed when protecting a crime scene, so it's essential to make every effort for continuous improvement. Different crime types. Legal cannabis businesses are most often robbed or burglarized, so we're going to be looking at different crime scene classifications and how you would classify certain crimes. Law enforcement would describe these as organized break-ins, typically done by a crew, which is most common in retail cannabis dispensaries, but product theft could happen in cultivation operations and distribution centers too. Just like any commercial enterprise, cannabis businesses should expect a return on taxes paid for city services, such as law enforcement protection and industry regulatory bodies. Robberies may be a common issue in the cannabis industry, but you'll still need to consider other crimes and know how to handle those different types. You can never be sure of what type of crime you're going to encounter, so always examine what types of crimes are prevalent in the area, whether it's homicides, sexual assault, drug offenses, etc. These are just a couple of examples, so always check for the different types of local crime that's occurring, the frequency, and the percentage that they happen. Age group. When investigating crime scenes, age could play a factor, since certain crimes are more likely to be committed by different age groups. By identifying the age group, it can help increase the odds when you're trying to identify a specific individual, based on the information of who you might be looking for as a potential suspect. Physical locations. There are various types of physical locations. Keep in mind that you have indoor locations such as retail dispensaries, outdoor locations such as cannabis cultivation operations, and even car or vehicle locations for residential deliveries. These all have their challenges, so you must take these all into consideration and be able to handle any of these, because sometimes you may even have multiple physical locations involved for a crime. Victim's location. The primary crime scene typically is the original location of the crime, but there can be secondary scenes for the same criminal, and these alternate locations are where additional evidence is found many times. For example, if someone was kidnapped from a retail cannabis dispensary and transported to another location, that the criminal transported the person to, etc. Remember that if you're observing one particular crime scene, there is always the potential for other crime scenes that may need to be investigated. Crime scene size. When you look at the size of the crime scene, there's everything from the macroscopic level down to the microscopic level. A macroscopic crime scene will contain many individual microscopic scenes within it, and is basically where the victim's body is found in the retail dispensary from a gunshot, something you can see very easily. But a microscopic level would have trace evidence, such as gunshot residue and other small types of evidence, that investigators could be looking at under a microscope. Always keep in mind that you'll want to be very mindful of the large-scale macroscopic items, but never forget about the small-scale microscopic items, since they can make a huge difference in an investigation. Scene search methods. There are different search methods when searching a crime scene for evidence, so this must be done comprehensively, and anything found needs to be systematically logged as evidence during the investigation. You never want to make assumptions, consider everything as possible evidence, and never overlook little details, because it can easily lead to accusations of negligence or covering up evidence. Don't ever assume, since that allows unconscious biases to creep in, so it is essential to be impartial, but also very thorough, systematically logging, and always detail-oriented. Field evidence technician. Field evidence technicians are responsible for searching. They're looking for fingerprints, footprints, tool marks, hair fibers, and other trace evidence. The field evidence technician should be photographing the crime scene and documenting every detail, because this role plays a crucial part in the search for evidence that's a critical part of any scene investigation. Before search begins, before you start looking for that evidence, you want to ensure the crime scene is controlled, and this includes briefing all searchers involved and establishing areas of responsibility. Everyone involved should have a game plan and a clear role, so there's a limited number of people, so no one interferes with anyone else's area in their search or contaminates the crime scene in any way. You want to determine a starting point, establish a command post, maintain communication between everyone that's involved, and be available to address anything that comes up, so everyone is aware. It is crucial to rotate crime investigators through scene areas to ensure more than one person looks at each area, to reduce the chance that small details are missed. Being human, we're prone to miss some little details, yet you don't have a ton of law enforcement going into a crime scene either, but having some investigators go through and do a second sweep of an area is well advised. Scene search patterns. Spiral search. A spiral search method starts at the outer point of the crime scene and gradually moves toward the center, or you're going to start at an inner point and move outward from that center to the farthest points. So, depending on the room, the retail dispensary, outdoor canvas, cultivation site, etc., all may influence what type of search method you use for the crime scene. Grid method. The grid method is what it sounds like. So the crime scene is divided into a grid, and each grid is segmented in the different search areas. This is commonly used when there's an area that's a crime scene, so there will be a boxy-like look grid that's assigned to be searched, and different teams are focusing on those different boxes. Within that overall grid, first, investigation work is done from left to right, and then redone from top to bottom. In this way, every area is explored more than once to ensure that nothing is missed. Patterns line search. A line pattern search is dividing an area into strips, and each strip is searched, but this could be based on limiting factors and another search pattern to keep in mind that can be used for line or parallel searches in a crime scene. This is used to search relatively large areas at crime scenes, and a square area is divided into parallel strips or lanes, with one investigator per lane. The investigator slowly walks a roughly straight line through the middle of the lane and visually covers the full width of their lane. Zone pattern search. A zone pattern search is when an area search is divided as a quadrant, or zone search has similar properties to the grid method, but the scene is divided into quadrants, and each quadrant is a zone searched. In a zone search, the crime scene is divided into quadrants, and each team takes one sector. Then teams will switch quadrants and search again to ensure complete coverage. This is a little bit broader based, but the important aspect of this method is documenting specific directions. For example, north, south, etc. is involved to know where the zones are located in a space, and what evidence might be found in those areas, or how that space might be located can influence the search. Search pattern selection. This general overview will help determine which search pattern you're going to use, but typically it comes down to the size, type of location of the area, whether it's an indoor location or outdoor location. Also, the personnel and equipment that are available will determine your search approach based on what you have access to. We always have the ideal number of resources, but many times those are limited and restricted, so that's going to influence what search method you select. Even the type of crime that was committed can impact the type of evidence that's going to be collected and influence what type of search pattern chosen that'll be effective. Victim evidence and investigation questions. Evidence from a victim will be collected by a medical examiner and often includes the actual victim's body, where it's used as evidence too. This could include anything from fiber on clothing to hair from their head, photographic evidence, blood samples, and even hand swabs for gunpowder, if they were involved in the crime. There is a lot of information that'll be collected just from the victim's body, and you're kind of going through when searching a crime scene to be effective and efficient, because it is only a one-time shot at getting that evidence undisturbed. You'll be investigating crime scene questions. It's the kind of the what, who, where, when, how, and the why involved with crime scenes. Who question. Let's start with who did it. This is the first question most people consider and the most important one, yet be mindful that there could be only one person or multiple people involved committing the crime. So remember that when you're considering who did it. What question. Always consider who has a motive to commit a crime, to begin the what happened inquiries. Never make assumptions. And this is easier said than done, since items at the crime scene may be rearranged to create misdirection for the investigation. It's important to be looking at the details and not make assumptions when trying to answer what may have happened at the crime scene. Where question. Determining where it happened. So was it one location, or were other locations that might be involved? Just something was identified at one particular location. There could be other ones involved where the actual act may have occurred in one area to another physical location. So, where did it happen may not necessarily be the exact location where the initial crime investigation started. One question. Then, when did it happen is the all-important time factor. For example, knowing the time of a victim's death can help try to pinpoint details to critical 1 to 2 hour time frames before death. So this is kind of that crucial time. That is 1 to 2 hours. What can be established is how many details can be gotten about that particular time. Just before death can help explain or provide some great information regarding the crime scene that they're investigating. How question. Determining how it happens requires the identification of specific items that were used at the crime scene. For example, a gun may seem obvious during a robbery, but less likely items can be used, for example, knife, mace, etc., depending on the criminal act that was done. Never immediately assume, for example, I'm looking for the criminal's gun, etc., or anything, since very simple items can become very vital evidence for how it was done. Why question. Finally, why did it happen? This can often be a perplexing question, since determining the motive is not necessarily the main goal of an investigation, but this can play into the recreation of the crime scene. Did they have financial problems before they decided to rob a cannabis dispensary? In the cannabis industry, the potential financial incentives for anyone help us to explain potentially why a crime happened. Crime scene victims. Who was or were the victims? Do they have any connections with organized crime? Where were they before passing at the scene of the crime? These are critical time frames for a crime scene investigation. Once you establish the time of death for an individual, investigators will get as much information about the victim's activities preceding the crime. By doing this, it can help pinpoint or eliminate certain potential suspects when you're looking at what the victim was doing before the crime was committed. Finding evidence. When searching for evidence at the scene of the crime, keep in mind that the goal is to prove the motive for the crime, so be sure to document everything, take photos, and sketch the scene. These are important aspects. You're not necessarily looking at documenting everything to determine the motive for a crime and answer that question. Yet, through the investigative process, there will be enough data collected to determine the motive later in the investigation, so those questions can be answered eventually. Crime scene question summary. These are the different questions to ask that'll help to keep in mind all of the answers needed to determine from the investigation: who did it, what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen, how did it happen, why did it happen, who were the victims, and what evidence is there to help prove the motive of that crime. All these questions should hopefully be answered with the proper forensics techniques, along with crime scene analysis and evidence collection. Defining crime scene. Let's review some specific details for evidence collection and how they pertain to some individual pieces of evidence you might be looking at collecting. Keep in mind, you first want to define the crime, because scenes are never consistent, since every one of them is unique, so each will present different challenges. First, determine the area that will be searched and ensure this is protected from anyone entering or exiting, to ensure there's no alteration of evidence that you're going to be collecting. Performing evidence collection. Keep in mind, this needs to be systematic and detail-oriented, so start with a preliminary kind of crime scene survey to determine the evidence that'll be collected and the search method to utilize. Since every crime scene is unique, make sure you're utilizing the best search method that best fits the evidence you intend on collecting. Maintain evidence integrity. During a crime scene investigation, the goal of evidence collection is to ensure that every item that's collected as evidence is of the highest integrity possible. This goal is to keep this evidence in its original condition, so it's the same as when it was found at the crime scene. So whenever possible, evidence should be submitted to the laboratory intact. Examples such as blood, hair, fiber, soil particles, and other types of trace evidence should not normally be removed from garments, weapons, etc., into collection bags or even whatever item they're located on. You want to move the entire item, for example, vehicles, etc., to provide the laboratory. When anything is sent to the laboratory for processing, every item needs to be isolated and contained from each other to reduce the odds of any potential cross-contamination that would occur. Label all containers. To maintain consistency, be sure everything is always labeled, so every container is marked and sealed at the crime scene before being moved. This will be a tedious task, since many items will have both a primary and secondary container. So you may have a primary container that's wrapped in a secondary container, carefully placed in a plastic bottle, which is then placed in a bag. Since there could be multiple large search areas where you're collecting evidence and temporarily placing it in a bag while searching. But always remember everything needs to be labeled, and it's a tedious but very necessary process to maintain the integrity of an investigation. Proper labeling contains. Labels will have certain requirements, for example, case number, offense, crime location, date of offense, evidence description, vehicle model or serial numbers, evidence collector's initials, etc. All of this needs to be documented on every label for each piece of evidence that's collected. This is part of that chain of custody COC. This is establishing the initial evidence and keeping track of where it is going next, for example, laboratory, etc., or who is responsible for the evidence that's in the COC. Evidence collection equipment. There's equipment that's used for evidence collection, and there will be a variety of items used, such as gloves, forceps, and tweezers, being required for smaller trace evidence, and depending on the type of crime, there could be scalpels, swabs, etc. Many times paper bags are used as storage containers. Plastic bags are often not advised in general, but can be used for some objects. Carbon boxes will typically be used for larger items, as well as wrapping paper, thermometers, plastic buckets, etc. for large objects, to prevent them from getting damaged. The equipment used during evidence collection is quite varied, because each tool is designed to eliminate the chance of the evidence being altered or damaged in any way. Physical evidence. The goal is to prevent any alterations to physical evidence from when it was collected until received at the laboratory, when you're handling any type of evidence in general. You need to ensure it's photographed before being collected, then always handle it in a way that maintains the integrity of the sample, which many times it's not how you'd normally hold that particular object. For example, you don't want to grab a firearm by the actual hand grip, since there could be fingerprints on it. Therefore, when picking up a firearm, pick it up using gloves or cloth so you don't contaminate evidence, because that's typically where the fingerprints may be. Picking it up that way might be awkward, but it'll preserve the integrity, where someone would hold the gun using its hand grip, where the fingerprint evidence exists. General evidence packaging. When packaging and labeling evidence, always use separate containers for every single item that's collected from the crime scene. This reduces the chance of any damage or cross-contamination of the evidence. The standard packaging requirements for evidence items should be placed in appropriate sized containers, and this is why investigators will have many different sizes to make sure it's the appropriate size for what's being collected. For example, if a folding knife is found open, do not fold it closed, and it should be placed in separate sharp tubes, then secured with tape, so that the blade doesn't open. This is to preserve the evidence itself, but also to protect from accidentally harming investigators while collecting different sharp objects. Narcotics packaging requirements. There are specific packaging requirements for narcotics. Many times cannabis is considered a narcotic that might be collected as evidence at the crime scene. When packaging narcotics, there are very specific processes that investigators are required to go through, but dangerous substances should always be isolated and placed in protective envelopes. Investigators will weigh and document each type of narcotic found at the crime scene, including its current packaging when discovered during the search. They will conduct presumptive tests to have an idea of what type of narcotic was found, for the package labeled and seal it, using evidence tape with the investigator's initials and date. Once narcotics are packaged, they'll be weighed again in their complete packaging, and investigators will document the weight growth or difference on the outside of the package again. Investigators will keep even the drug paraphernalia in separate packaging, so everything is important to document, and at every single step throughout the investigation. Firearms packaging requirements. For firearms packaging, investigators will take pictures before ever touching a firearm, so they make note of the position of the bolt and slide, chamber and hammer, where is safety placed, position of the cylinder, any cartridges found, etc. When handling firearms, always turn the weapon safety on to ensure the gun isn't accidentally fired. Then your next step is to unload all the bullets from the firearm. Afterward, when packaging the firearm, they are one of the few items that can be stored in plastic containers, similar to knives, metal objects, etc., but make sure any ammunition that is found or unloaded is always packaged separately. Liquid and dry material collection. Liquids technique. If your evidence is wet from some type of liquid, then it must be air-dried before it is put in a plastic container, but always review what type of evidence must be air-dried before it's put in a container, since it might become altered within that container. When there's suspected biological evidence found on clothing or other absorbent surfaces, it is always transported to the laboratory in an appropriate container, and the entire substance will be collected, if possible. Never stack or fold evidence over on itself or other items. Always use paper wrapping to prevent contamination during the transfer process, since items should be air-dried thoroughly before being packaged in a container suitable for dry evidence. This means avoiding airtight containers due to the increased chance of mold growth over some time, since evidence may not get looked at right away. If the suspected biological evidence is a liquid form on a fixed surface that cannot be transported, like a concrete floor, then evidence should be recovered using a dried material collection technique. That's the only way it should be removed from the actual crime scene. Dried materials. Dried materials are always moving throughout the crime scene, whether from air circulation or natural wind, so investigators will use gloved hands to slightly motion a swab with distilled water. The swab will be damp and overly wet. Then it's thoroughly rubbed on the materials using a single motion swab for small areas and multiple swabs for a larger area. Then the swabs will be air-dried and placed in separate packages that are properly labeled, then placed inside a protective envelope. When collecting a substrate, you'll need to protect that evidence sample from other materials in the collection, so there are going to be certain techniques utilized depending on what material is being collected. Certain techniques must be followed to ensure evidence maintains its integrity in the future and has the proper documentation step so it can be used in the legal system. Different evidence types. Let's learn how to investigate different types of evidence and how to classify them. Two main categories. With these two primary evidence categories, it's important to know what category the evidence that's collected is being classified. For example, whether it's a direct or testimonial, or whether it's circumstantial. There's a main broad classification of evidence that may be collected. 1. Direct or testimonial evidence. Direct or testimonial evidence includes first-hand observations, such as eyewitness accounts, written statements, confessions, video cameras, etc., and testimonies may sound convincing, but they'll always be cross-examined in the legal system. even if there are testimonies documented after a crime has been committed. This is still classified as direct or testimonial evidence. The legal system will require additional evidence that supports a testimony. 2. Circumstantial physical evidence. Circumstantial is indirect physical evidence that can be used to imply a fact, but does not necessarily directly prove it. When you look at any evidence that would be collected at a crime scene, it would also include items found in the suspect's possession. This evidence wasn't found directly at the crime scene, but that evidence may be necessary to use, since it could help understand what had happened at the crime scene. There are different types of physical evidence, and with each of these different types, it can be something simple like trash collected or complex types like DNA, fingerprints, etc. So all sorts of things can be collected. Chain of custody. Chain of custody (COC) relates to the crime scene's processing and handling of evidence. What is the COC? It is a recorded list of all persons who come in possession of any specific item. That's considered evidence. The goal is to maintain a document that includes exactly what happened to each piece of evidence, from when it was discovered until it is finally presented to the legal system. This ensures there's a paper trail of where the evidence went and who touched it. Chain of custody requirements. Chain of custody (COC) will include the evidence's item number, a brief description that identifies the location where the item was stored, date and time of all transfers that may have occurred, a signature every person releasing the evidence to another individual or location, the signature of the individual transferring the evidence or receiving from other individuals or locations, and the reason for that transfer, etc. So there are a lot of requirements associated here with the COC, but it is a very important part of the process. The evidence container must have identified markings, along with the collector's initials, being placed on the seal too. If evidence is turned over to another person, the transfer must be recorded as evidence in a transmittal sheet and documented, so every piece of evidence that's collected will be upheld in the court of law. Evidence transmittal sheet. An evidence transmittal sheet documents the chain of custody (COC) for an entire evidence list from a single crime scene where it's packaged separately and numbered sequentially as part of the investigation. These transmittal sheets include all the information that's required in the legal system to ensure all the hard work that went into acquiring the evidence isn't tampered with in any way and can be held up for the investigation. Crime scene processing. Crime scene processing is how you would process a crime scene. It starts with initiating the primary objectives for the investigation, which is always safety first. Throughout the investigation, it is essential to maintain safe conditions, no matter where the crime scene is located, and that'll vary depending on what's being investigated and environmental factors happening at the scene. Always ensure the scene is secure and keep everyone at a safe distance. For example, if a retail dispensary is caught on fire during the crime, you'll want to prevent people from entering or exiting a scene. The more people at the scene of a crime is going to create more variability, potentially for the evidence that will be collected, so always maintain protection of the scene. The first officer at the crime scene is responsible for securing and protecting the area using the crime scene tape and other physical barriers. If there are any victims, they will be interviewed and possibly be allowed to enter the scene to reenact the crime they witnessed for investigators to gain a better understanding of what happened. Of course, the goal is not to compromise the crime scene's evidence in any way, and when witnesses are present, make sure they do not roam around the crime scene. Once the crime scene is secure, make sure no one is unwittingly entering that scene. Then the next step to process the scene will be to go through photographing everything and documenting the scene by making a sketch, particularly if there's a victim's body caused by the crime. They will always ensure they're taking very detailed notes, along with collecting, labeling, and packaging any evidence that's found, then ultimately writing a report for everything discovered. When protecting crime scenes, anyone who enters the scene has the potential to destroy physical evidence, and most of the time the damage is unintentional. Always remember that someone might unintentionally do a lot of damage to the evidence collection process, and everyone not essential for the investigation should be excluded from the scene, including police officers not directly involved in the investigation. Scene investigator responsibilities. Crime scene investigators have a limited amount of time to work, and there is a lot to do, and it always seems like there's never enough time to get it done. Photograph documentation. When taking photographs, ensure that they're of the crime scene unaltered, so every object must remain untouched until photographed. If evidence has been moved or removed, then it must be mentioned in the actual report. If there's any proof that the crime scene was compromised, it would cause the evidence to be inadmissible in court. That's the main thing everyone is trying to protect during an investigation, and make sure all the evidence that's being collected can be used in the legal system. Crime scene photography. Some photography basics that investigators should be thoughtful of are always very detailed photographs in all areas where the crime took place, like entry and exit points. Remember to include different angles. It's important to have established medium range, close-up, and macroscopic photographs. This will even include the use of a ruler in the photographs to use as a size reference that'll help establish the general size of different objects that are being documented for evidence. Crime scene sketch. Sketches of the crime scene should always be created at the scene of the crime. This includes a rough sketch that will be made before ever leaving the scene. As part of the processing phase, there is the development of a final sketch, as the investigation tries to precisely recreate the entire crime scene. All sketches will need a legend showing where certain items were located in the crime scene and indicating what direction is north, so that's always included in sketches too. There will be a title legend for any abbreviations or symbols that are used within the sketch too, such as a compass direction, showing at least the north direction, a measurement scale, and documentation with the location, date, and time in the sketch creator's name. This all is required for any sketches created, and be sure that everything is being documented in the sketch for the most important pieces of evidence found. Always remember to include entry points, exit points, distances, so these are all very important details that need to be documented in the sketch. Detailed note-taking. Always be taking notes. They should include the location of the crime scene, the date and time of notification, evidence that's found, who it was from, time of arrival and departure, scene details, description of the victim, and names of everyone on the investigation team. It's a lot to process in a very short period of time, and having an idea of what you need beforehand helps to get everything completed in a relatively efficient manner is very important. Like many jobs and tasks in the cannabis industry, planning is one of the first steps toward developing a thorough interpretation or action steps needed to reach any goal. In the process of crime scene investigation, this approach is not only common sense but also vital. To properly analyze and interpret any crime scene, certain basic steps must be followed in order to create a sense of beginning and a sensible conclusion to the examination. Thank you for viewing Crime Scene Investigation and Protection.